The silence that finally broke me wasn't loud. It wasn't a slammed door or a shouted word. It was the soft, almost elegant clink of a silver fork being set down on porcelain, a sound that barely registered over the low hum of Christmas carols playing from the living room. My fiancé's mother, Henrietta, had just delivered her annual assessment of my life's work, and the clink of her fork was the period at the end of the sentence. The words she used hung in the air between us, heavy and slick as the gravy boat suspended in my hand. Hobby. It landed in the small pause, in the breath between one family member asking for the mashed potatoes and another reaching for the rolls. And in that silence, I watched the only thing that mattered. Marcus. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend. He just smiled. It was a small, private, almost imperceptible thing, a slight upward turn at the corner of his mouth, an expression of quiet agreement meant only for his mother. And in that smile, the entire foundation of our 6 years together turned to dust. My name is Yvette. I am 35 years old, and I am a civil engineer. I design bridges, retaining walls, and drainage systems, the invisible infrastructure that keeps a city from collapsing into itself. I work with concrete and steel, with load-bearing capacities and stress tolerances. My entire profession is built on a single, unshakable principle. A structure is only as sound as its foundation. For a long time, I believed the same was true of love. Marcus was 39. We had been engaged for 4 years of our 6 years together, a period of stasis so prolonged it had ceased to be a transition and had become a destination. Long enough for me to understand that some structures aren't built to last. They're built for comfort, for appearance, designed to look solid from a distance, but up close, you can see the hairline fractures, the subtle bowing of a wall that's carrying a weight it was never meant to bear. I was that wall. The moment it happened, the moment the fracture became a catastrophic failure, was at that Christmas dinner. We were at his mother's house in Ballantyne, the air thick with the scent of roasted turkey and simmering resentment. Henrietta held court from the head of the table, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing as she spoke. She'd always had a way of appraising my life as if it were an item up for auction, something she was considering bidding on, but would ultimately find lacking. "It's just wonderful that Yvette has her little projects," she said, her voice smooth and condescending. She turned to her sister, who was visiting from Atlanta. "She's so creative with her little drawings." I said nothing, my hand tightening around the serving spoon. My little drawings were geotechnical schematics for a municipal bridge project that would serve 500,000 commuters a day. They were the product of a master's degree, a professional engineering license, and 10 years of grueling, meticulous work. Marcus laughed lightly, a sound meant to sand down the sharp edges of his mother's words. "It's a bit more than drawings, Mom." Henrietta waved a dismissive hand, adorned with the diamond ring his father had given her 30 years prior. "Oh, I know, dear. It's very impressive. But let's be honest," she said, her eyes sweeping over the table before landing on me with a look of pitying finality. "Yvette's career is more of a hobby. Marcus is the real provider here." And then came the clink of the fork, the silence, and the smile. It wasn't a malicious smile. It was worse. It was a smile of quiet confirmation, a shared understanding between mother and son, a closed circuit I was not, and would never be, a part of. He was the provider. I was the hobbyist. It was their foundational truth, a story they told themselves, a narrative so deeply ingrained that the 5-figure sum that left my bank account every month to pay for the roof over our heads was rendered invisible, an inconvenient fact in the face of a more comfortable fiction. In my line of work, we perform something called a structural audit. You examine a bridge or a building, not just for its surface-level appeal, but for its hidden weaknesses. You look for the slow, creeping erosion, the subtle corrosion, the patterns of stress that betray a deeper, systemic flaw. That night, sitting at that dinner table, I began a silent audit of my own, and I realized this wasn't a new crack. It was an old one I had been plastering over for years, pretending it was nothing more than a cosmetic flaw. The Archaeology of Disrespect began the day we got the keys to our apartment in Noda. It was 2019, a bright, optimistic Charlotte afternoon, but I was the only one at the closing table. Marcus was supposed to be there, but at the last minute, the underwriter had flagged his credit score. Years of mismanaged student loans and a car note he'd defaulted on in his 20s had left a trail of red flags. The bank was polite but firm. The loan could only be in my name. My salary, my credit, my savings, they were the only things that qualified. I remember sitting in the sterile law office, the scent of paper and stale coffee in the air, signing my name over and over again. My hand ached by the end of it. The down payment had drained my savings, a sum I had meticulously built since my first internship. Marcus called me as I was leaving. "Did we get it? Is it ours?" he'd asked, the we and ours sitting strangely in the air. "It's done," I said, the words feeling hollow. "The keys are at the front desk." He picked them up on his lunch break. An hour later, a photo appeared on his Instagram story. It was his hand, holding the new keys, dangling in front of our new front door. The caption read, "Finally a homeowner. Hard work pays off." There were 100 congratulatory replies. "You earned it, man. Proud of you, bro. Provider." I stood in the empty living room, the echo of my footsteps on the hardwood floors the only sound, and I stared at that photo on my phone. He hadn't tagged me. He hadn't mentioned my presence at the closing table, my name on the deed, my money in the bank. He had simply edited me out of my own accomplishment. When I brought it up that evening, my voice quiet, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "What's the big deal?" he'd said, already unpacking a box of his video games. "It's our place. We're a team. It's not a competition, babe. We both contribute." That was one of his favorite lines. We both contribute. It was a phrase designed to suggest equality where there was none. It was the verbal equivalent of a beautifully designed but non-load-bearing decorative column. It looked supportive, but it was carrying none of the weight. His contribution was his presence. Mine was the mortgage, the utilities, the property taxes, and the 3 years of his student loan payments that I agreed to take over so he could get back on his feet. That was another excavation site in my mental audit. The 5th of every month, for 36 consecutive months, a charge for $1,847 appeared on my bank statement. Sally Mae. It was an automatic draft I had set up myself, a silent monthly sacrifice made on the altar of our shared future. We never spoke of it. It was my secret contribution, my quiet shoring up of his compromised financial foundation. The only time it was ever referenced indirectly was at another family dinner, a year or so before the final Christmas. Henrietta was praising Marcus for his financial acumen. "I'm just so proud of how disciplined you are with your money, son," she'd said, beaming at him across a platter of her famous macaroni and cheese. "Paying off those loans all by yourself. It shows character." Marcus had nodded, accepting the praise as if it were his due. He caught my eye for a split second, a flicker of something, shame maybe, or just discomfort, before looking away. He didn't correct her. He didn't say, Actually, Mom, Yvette has been paying them for 2 years. He just let the lie settle, let it become part of the family lore. Marcus, the responsible one. Marcus, the provider. I remember picking at my food, the rich, cheesy pasta suddenly tasting like ash. The invisible labor wasn't just the money. It was the emotional weight of carrying the truth in silence. It was sitting at a table full of his family, being praised for my cooking, while he was being praised for my financial sacrifice. The imbalance was staggering. I was the bedrock, the unseen foundation, and he was the gleaming facade they all admired. The hobby narrative had its own origin story. It started small, with Henrietta's visits to our apartment. I often worked from home on Saturdays, my dining table covered in large format blueprints and engineering scales. I loved those quiet mornings, the smell of coffee brewing, the satisfying scratch of my pen on the vellum, the city's infrastructure taking shape under my hands. The first time Henrietta saw it, she'd tilted her head with a look of amused curiosity. "Oh, look at you with your little drawings," she'd cooed, patting my shoulder. "It's so nice you have something to keep you busy." I had tried to explain. "This is for the I-277 expansion project, Henrietta. It's a multi-year contract with the county." She'd just smiled that placid, dismissive smile. "That's nice, dear." Later, Marcus would deliver the echo. "Mom doesn't mean it like that. You're reading into it." It was his standard defense, his way of invalidating my feelings and protecting his mother in one smooth motion. He wasn't defending me from her. He was defending the family's narrative from the intrusion of my reality. This was the pattern. Henrietta would offer the initial dismissal, and Marcus would later soften it, reframe it, and ultimately endorse it through his inaction. When we talked about getting married, a conversation that always seemed to end in frustrating ambiguity, he deployed his mother as a shield. "Mom thinks we should wait till you're more established. You know how she is," he'd said one night, as if quoting from a script. "More established?" I'd asked, the words catching in my throat. "Marcus, I'm a senior project manager. I make 6 figures. I own our home. How much more established do I need to be?" He'd sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's not about the money, Yvette. It's about stability. She just wants to see you settled in your career path, not just jumping from project to project." Jumping from project to project was the definition of my career. It was how civil engineering worked. You completed a bridge, you moved to a retaining wall. You finished a drainage system, you consulted on a new highway. To him, to them, my progress was instability. My ambition was a flight risk. The truth was, his mother didn't want me to be more established. She wanted me to be less of a threat to the established order of things, where her son was the sun around which all other planets were meant to orbit. The audit continued, excavating memories I had long since buried under layers of justification. I remembered the trip we took to Asheville for our 3rd anniversary. I had received a significant bonus for bringing a project in under budget and ahead of schedule. I'd paid for the entire trip. The stay at the Grove Park Inn, the expensive dinners, the spa treatments. It was my treat, a celebration of my success. When we returned, Henrietta asked Marcus how the trip was. "It sounds like you really spoiled her," she'd said, winking at him. "It's good to see a man taking care of his woman." And Marcus, once again, had let the lie stand. He'd puffed out his chest just a little. She deserved it. It was then I realized that my money was only real to them when it could be laundered through him, repackaged as his provision. My success was only palatable when it could be framed as his generosity. My contribution had to be invisible for their comfort to remain intact. I was not a partner. I was a silent investor in the enterprise of Marcus, a ghostwriter for the story of his success. And so, every Christmas, the theme would reappear, slightly different each time. One year, my job was a cute little passion project. The next, it was a wonderful way for her to express her creative side. Each iteration was a subtle sanding down of my professional identity, a slow and steady erosion of my worth in their eyes, and, if I was being honest, in my own. I had started to internalize it. I found myself downplaying my achievements around his family, speaking about my work in vague, humble terms, careful not to seem too ambitious, too successful, too much. I was complicit in my own erasure. I had accepted the terms. I had allowed my strength to be rebranded as his, because I loved him, because I thought that was the price of admission to his family, to our future. I thought my endurance was a form of love. I thought that if I just held the wall steady for long enough, he would eventually see the load I was carrying and come stand beside me to help bear the weight. But that Christmas, when he smiled at the word hobby, I finally understood. He wasn't going to stand beside me. He had no intention of ever acknowledging the load. He was comfortable. He liked the arrangement. He liked the view from the top of a structure he hadn't had to build. The smile wasn't an accident. It was a confession. It was the same smile I'd seen 3 Christmases running, and in that moment of horrifying clarity, I saw it for what it was. The signature on a contract I had never agreed to sign. In engineering, there's a concept called material fatigue. It's when a structure fails after being subjected to repeated, cyclical stress, even if that stress is well below the material's ultimate tensile strength. It's not the one big hit that breaks it, it's the thousands of small, persistent pressures that wear it down over time, creating microscopic cracks that eventually connect and cause a catastrophic failure. My heart, my spirit, my tolerance. It had reached its fatigue limit. The feeling that washed over me wasn't anger, it wasn't even sadness. It was a profound and sudden stillness. The chaos of years of quiet frustration, of biting my tongue and swallowing my pride, it all just stopped. It was the calm inside a hurricane's eye. A decision had been made, not in my mind, but somewhere deeper, in the very bedrock of my being. The audit was complete. The structure was condemned. The weeks after Christmas were a masterclass in quiet duplicity. On the surface, nothing changed. I made coffee in the morning. I kissed Marcus goodbye as he left for his marketing job. I cooked dinner. I asked about his day. I performed the role of the loving fiancé with a chilling precision. But inside, I was already gone. I was a ghost in my own home, methodically preparing for an exodus he would never see coming. My profession had taught me to be meticulous, to plan for every contingency. An exit, I decided, should be executed with the same precision as a construction project. It required a blueprint, a timeline, and a clear understanding of the existing conditions. The first step was a consultation with a lawyer who specialized in property law. I took a half-day off work and sat in her quiet South End office, the city skyline visible through her window. I laid out the documents, the deed to the apartment, the mortgage statements, the bank records showing every single payment originating from my personal account. "It's ironclad," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "The property is solely yours. As you are not married, he has no legal claim to it. He is, in legal terms, a tenant." A tenant. The word struck me. It was so clean, so devoid of the messy emotional history. For 6 years, I had thought of him as my partner, my future husband. The law saw him as a tenant, and I, the landlord, had decided it was time for the lease to end. The next phase was financial separation. I opened a new checking account at a different bank. I spent an evening online, meticulously rerouting my direct deposit, changing the payment information for my car, my insurance, my personal bills. It felt like redirecting a river, diverting the flow of my resources away from the shared reservoir and back to its source, me. While Marcus was in the living room watching a basketball game, cheering loudly at the television, I was at the dining room table, the same table where I drafted my little drawings, drafting the schematics of my new life. He glanced over at one point, seeing me hunched over my laptop and a pile of papers. "Working late?" he asked during a commercial break. "Just tying up some loose ends on a project," I said. It wasn't a lie. He came over and wrapped his arms around my shoulders from behind, kissing the top of my head. The gesture, which once would have felt warm and loving, now felt like an intrusion, a trespass on a work site he was no longer authorized to enter. "You work too hard," he murmured into my hair. "You don't have to prove anything to her or to me." I froze. His words, meant to be comforting, were a perfect crystalline monument to his ignorance. He thought I was still fighting for his mother's approval. He had no idea I was long past that. I wasn't trying to prove my worth. I was documenting it, cataloging it, and preparing to reclaim it. I leaned back into his embrace for a fraction of a second, a final act of performance. "I know," I said softly. The final stage of preparation was an inventory. One Saturday morning, while he was out playing golf with friends, I walked through the apartment with a legal pad. I made 2 columns, mine and his. The mine column was long. The apartment itself, the sofa, the dining table, the bed, the television, the art on the walls, the pots and pans in the kitchen. The list went on and on. The his column was shockingly short. His clothes, his golf clubs, his PlayStation, a reclining chair he'd bought on Black Friday, a few boxes of books and memorabilia in the closet. Seeing it all written down in black and white was stark. I hadn't just paid for the apartment, I had furnished our entire life. His presence had been the only thing he'd moved in. I had mistaken it for a partnership, but it was, in fact, a residency. I had provided the stage, the props, and the script. He had simply played the part. The day I chose was a Tuesday. It felt ordinary, unremarkable, a perfect day for a quiet demolition. I came home from work early. I went to the file cabinet in the spare bedroom where I kept our important documents. I pulled out the original closing packet from 2019. The thick stack of papers felt heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of the weight I had been carrying. I spread the key documents out on the dining room table like a place setting. The deed, with my name, Yvette Dubois, typed in bold black letters. The final mortgage approval letter, addressed only to me. A summary of the mortgage payments for the past year, showing the automatic drafts from my Wells Fargo account. It was an exhibition of truth, curated and displayed in the heart of the home he thought was his. My symbol, my final statement. When I heard his keys in the door, my heart didn't race. It was steady. My breath was even. I felt a strange sense of calm, the quiet focus that comes before a critical test. I was a structure, designed and built by me, and I was about to test my own tensile strength. He walked in, dropping his gym bag by the door, and saw me standing by the table. He smiled, that easy, handsome smile that had once been the blueprint for my future. "Hey, babe, what's for dinner?" Then his eyes fell to the table, to the spread of official-looking papers. His smile faltered. What's all this? I didn't answer immediately. I let him look. I let him read the words, see my name, and only my name, over and over again. I watched his face as the comfortable fiction of his life began to unravel in real time. The color drained from it slowly, like water seeping into dry ground. Yvette? What's going on? His voice had a new edge to it, a note of panic. This is the deed to the apartment, Marcus, I said, my voice as level and steady as a freshly poured concrete slab. And the mortgage, and the proof of payment for every single month we've lived here. He stared at me, his confusion curdling into defensive anger. Okay, so, what's your point? Are you trying to throw that in my face? No, I said quietly. I'm stating a fact. This has always been my apartment. I've just been letting you live in it. The air crackled. The casual intimacy of our shared life evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard language of ownership and law. He looked from the papers to me, his jaw tightening. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Are you kicking me out? I took a breath. This was the moment, the final load test. I looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't soften the blow. I didn't manage his feelings. I just delivered the unvarnished fact. The deed has one name on it, I said. His entire posture changed. The easy confidence crumbled, revealing the fragile framework beneath. He looked around the living room, at the sofa, the television, the life he had taken for granted, as if seeing it for the first time as something that did not belong to him. He sputtered, trying to find his footing. After everything? After 6 years? You're just going to throw me out on the street? I'm not throwing you out, I corrected him gently. I'm asking my tenant to vacate the premises. I think 30 days is a reasonable notice, but given the circumstances, I think it's best if you pack a bag for tonight. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to argue. The evidence was right there on the table. The foundation was mine. The walls were mine. The roof was mine. He had only ever been a guest. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just deflated. All the air went out of him. He walked past me into the bedroom, the fight gone from his steps. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of clothes being thrown into a duffel bag. I stood there by the table, my hand resting on the cool paper of the deed. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel victorious. I felt a deep, quiet, and profound sense of relief. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying until it was gone. A few minutes later, he came out with 2 duffel bags and his golf clubs. He didn't look at me. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over his contacts. I knew who he was going to call. He was calling his mother. He was going home. He paused at the door, his back to me. I don't understand you, he said, his voice thick. I thought we were building a life together. We were, I said. But you can't build a life on a foundation you refuse to see. He shook his head and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden vast silence of the apartment. My apartment. The absence he left behind was immediate and palpable. It wasn't a void. It was space. Room to breathe. I walked through the quiet rooms, touching the walls, running my hand along the back of the sofa. It all felt different. It felt mine. The escalation cascade began within the hour. My phone started buzzing, a relentless series of texts and missed calls. First, it was Marcus. Shock and denial. You can't be serious. Call me. We need to talk about this. This is insane, Yvette. You're throwing away 6 years. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. My silence was the response. Then came the anger. You're being dramatic and manipulative. This is because of what my mom said, isn't it? You're punishing me for that. Unbelievable. After everything I've done for you. That last one almost made me laugh. Everything I've done for you. His presence, I supposed. His companionship. The privilege of building a life around him. The next morning, the call I was expecting came. Henrietta. I let it go to voicemail. She left a long, rambling message, her voice shifting from feigned concern to sharp-edged accusation. She called me immature, unstable, and ungrateful. She said I had betrayed her son. I deleted it without listening to the end. He had recruited his primary ally, the architect of the narrative that had brought us to this point. It was a predictable move. A few days later, Marcus tried a new tactic. Negotiation. He sent a long, carefully worded email. He apologized for his mother's comment. He said he should have defended me. He offered to go to couples counseling. He even mentioned setting a wedding date, for real this time. It was a compelling offer, filled with all the words I had longed to hear for years. But they were arriving too late. They were promises made from a position of loss, not from a place of love. He wasn't offering to change because he saw my value. He was offering to change because he had lost access to my resources. It was a business negotiation, not a heartfelt plea. I wrote back a short, simple reply. The time for that has passed, Marcus. I wish you the best. The final stage was the one I knew would be the hardest. Raw vulnerability. He asked if he could come by to pick up the rest of his things, and if we could talk, one last time, in person. I agreed. I needed the closure of seeing him in my space one last time, to confirm the new reality. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon. He looked tired, diminished. Without the backdrop of the life I had provided, he seemed smaller, less confident. We were civil as he boxed up his remaining belongings. The tension was thick, but it was a sad tension, not an angry one. When he was finished, he stood in the middle of the living room looking lost. I just don't get it, he said, his voice cracking. I loved you. I thought you loved me. Why are you doing this? I did love you, Marcus, I said, and it was the truth. But your love and your mother's approval came with a condition, that I pretend to be less than I am, that I make my strength invisible so you could feel strong. I'm not willing to pay that price anymore. He shook his head, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. And then he said it. The last line, the one that revealed everything, the absolute bedrock of his misunderstanding. I never said it wasn't your money, he said, his voice raw with a desperate, misplaced honesty. I just didn't think you'd weaponize it. The words hung in the air between us. Weaponize it. He saw my self-respect as a weapon. He saw my refusal to be erased as an attack. He saw my financial independence not as a contribution to our partnership, but as a threat he had to manage, a power he assumed I would never have the audacity to claim for myself. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a sudden heartbreaking clarity. He would never understand. He was structurally incapable of understanding. This isn't a weapon, Marcus, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It's a foundation. You just never saw it as mine. He had no reply to that. He picked up his last box and walked to the door. He paused, looked back at me one last time, and then he was gone. I locked the door behind him and leaned against it, the finality of the moment washing over me. It was over. The weeks that followed were filled with the sound of my own life. The silence he left behind was gradually filled with things I loved, the jazz music he'd always hated, the clatter of my own cooking without commentary, the long, uninterrupted phone calls with my sister. The apartment, once a stage for our shared life, began to feel like a sanctuary. My sanctuary. The first major act of reclamation was the bedroom. For years, I had wanted to paint it a deep, moody shade of Aegean blue, a color that felt like calm and depth. Marcus had always vetoed it. "It's too dark," he'd say. "It'll feel like a cave." So we had lived with a safe, boring beige for 6 years. The weekend after he moved out, I bought 3 cans of Aegean blue paint, rollers, and tape. I spent the entire Saturday transforming the room. As I rolled the rich color onto the walls, I felt like I was painting over the past, erasing the years of compromise and concession. When I was done, I stood in the doorway and looked at my work. It wasn't a cave. It was a harbor. It was beautiful. It was mine. My work, my supposed hobby, flourished. Freed from the constant low-grade stress of managing Marcus's ego and his mother's disdain, my focus became sharper, my creativity more expansive. I took on a leadership role in a major urban revitalization project, a complex and challenging endeavor that I threw myself into with a passion I hadn't felt in years. My little drawings were now the blueprints for a new public park, a new bridge, a new community space. I was building things that would last, things that would serve people, and the work filled me with a sense of purpose that no relationship ever had. My success wasn't a form of revenge. It was the natural, inevitable consequence of removing an obstruction. I hadn't been blocked. I had just been carrying too much weight. Months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I saw him. I was at a coffee shop in Dilworth, reviewing a set of schematics. I looked up as the bell on the door chimed, and there he was, ordering at the counter. He looked ordinary. He had lost the polished veneer he'd worn when he was with me, the subtle confidence that comes from living a life subsidized by someone else's labor. He was just a man, waiting for his coffee. He turned, and our eyes met. A flicker of recognition, of shared history, passed between us. He gave me a small, hesitant nod. I nodded back. There was no anger, no bitterness, no longing. There was just distance. A quiet acknowledgement of a past that felt like it belonged to someone else. He took his coffee and left. I turned back to my blueprints, my mind already on stress tolerances and load capacities. The foundation had been tested, and it had held. My foundation. It's a strange thing to spend years of your life meticulously building something for two, only to realize it was only ever meant for one. For a long time, I believed love was a structure you build together, brick by brick. I see now that isn't the whole truth. We must first be our own architects, our own engineers. We must build ourselves on a foundation of self-worth so solid that it cannot be eroded by someone else's narrative. Love is not about one person becoming the infrastructure for another. It's about two soundly built structures standing side by side, each with its own foundation, each carrying its own weight, creating a space between them that is safe, supportive, and true. Marcus didn't want a partner. He wanted a retaining wall, something to hold back the pressures of his own life so he could stand comfortably on the ground I had secured. My mistake wasn't paying for the apartment or his loans. My mistake wasn't my ambition or my success. My mistake was my silence. It was my willingness to accept a story that made me a footnote in my own life. The years I spent with him were not wasted time. They were the education I needed. They were the slow, painful stress test that revealed the fatal flaw in the design. You can't build a shared life on a foundation one person refuses to acknowledge exists. You can't create a partnership with someone who sees your strength as a hobby and your self-respect as a weapon. Some people only learn from loss. Some lessons can only be taught by the echo in an empty room. I live with a quiet that is no longer a sign of absence, but a symbol of peace. It is the sound of a well-built thing finally standing on its own. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.